The guns had fallen silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. Across muddy fields, scarred by trenches and pitted with shell craters, the wind carried not the thunder of artillery, but an eerie quiet. Millions had perished, empires had crumbled, and yet, in that silence, the world dared to dream that peace had finally come. But silence does not always mean safety, and peace is not always as permanent as it seems. From that quiet soil, seeds of discontent, anger, and longing for revenge would take root, growing slowly but surely into shadows that would stretch across 2 decades, until once again the world was plunged into war. The years between 1918 and 1939 are often overlooked, treated as a mere pause between 2 great conflicts. Yet in truth, they were a story all their own, a story of treaties and betrayals, of despair and hope, of ideologies rising and falling, of choices made and chances lost. To understand what really started the Second World War, we must wander gently through those years, tracing the path from silence to storm. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's somewhat comforting to imagine all of us, scattered across the globe, quietly unwinding together. So, breathe deeply, settle in, and allow the mysteries of time and memory to cradle your imagination. For in the quiet hours of the night, under the same stars watched by our ancestors, the secrets of history await, patiently, quietly, like distant constellations still shining from light years away. Let's begin. Imagine yourself standing in a quiet field in northern France on a cold November morning in 1918. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the horizon is still littered with barbed wire, shattered trees, and broken helmets left behind by soldiers who never returned home. Where once the sky shook with thunder and flame, there is only stillness now, as if the world itself is holding its breath. The war, they say, is over. The armistice has been signed, and with it, 4 years of unrelenting slaughter have come to an end. Yet in this silence, something lingers: grief, exhaustion, and an uncertain question of what comes next. The First World War had changed everything. Between 1914 and 1918, more than 16 million people had lost their lives, and millions more carried scars, both visible and invisible. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Farmlands that once produced golden harvests were transformed into muddy wastelands. Horses, once the backbone of armies, were replaced by machines that churned through men and earth alike. And when the guns finally ceased, the silence felt less like victory and more like a void. A world that had been certain of its progress now looked at itself with disbelief. How could civilization, with all its advances, have descended into such chaos? For the soldiers returning home, life after the armistice was not easy. They came back to families who barely recognized them. Some walked with missing limbs or relied on canes. Others carried no visible wounds, but bore nightmares that haunted them each night. They had left as young men, filled with purpose, and returned as shadows of themselves. In Britain, France, Germany, and across Europe, these veterans struggled to find work, to fit back into lives that had moved on without them. Street corners became gathering places for the unemployed, men who had once carried rifles now carrying only memories. In villages and towns, church bells rang to mark the end of the war, yet the sound often carried with it a hollow note. Families hung black cloths in their windows to mourn sons, fathers, and brothers who would never come back. War memorials began to rise, their stone surfaces etched with endless names, so many that small communities often saw nearly an entire generation carved into cold granite. At first, these memorials were places of sorrow where tears were shed daily. Later, they became places of ritual, where silence was observed each year on November the 11th, the weight of remembrance falling like a soft blanket over the living. But amidst the grief, there was also hope. People spoke of a new age. They believed that the suffering must mean something, that such sacrifice could not be in vain. Politicians promised a lasting peace. In the United States, President Woodrow Wilson spoke of his 14 points, a vision for a world built on fairness, self-determination, and cooperation. In Britain and France, leaders assured their citizens that victory would bring both justice and security. Out of this hope emerged the idea of the League of Nations, an organization meant to ensure that no conflict of such scale would ever erupt again. It was, for many, a fragile but necessary dream. Yet even as peace was promised, shadows began to stretch across the horizon. In Germany, the mood was bleak and uncertain. News of the armistice came suddenly, leaving ordinary Germans stunned. Many had been told their armies were still fighting on foreign soil, that victory was still possible. The truth, that defeat had come swiftly and absolutely, was difficult to comprehend. Whispers spread that Germany had not truly been beaten on the battlefield, but had been betrayed at home by weak politicians. This dangerous myth, the so-called stab-in-the-back legend, would fester in the years ahead, poisoning faith in democracy and fueling resentment that would be easily exploited. Elsewhere, the old order collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had ruled over many peoples for centuries, dissolved almost overnight. New nations emerged: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Austria, all struggling to define themselves amid poverty and uncertainty. The Ottoman Empire, once powerful, was fractured and occupied, its lands carved by foreign powers. In Russia, revolution had swept away the monarchy, replacing it with a new radical government that frightened the West and promised to spread its ideology beyond its borders. The map of Europe was redrawn, but the ink was barely dry before tensions began to rise again. On the streets of Paris, in late 1918 and early 1919, life buzzed with both relief and anticipation. Cafes were crowded with soldiers in tattered uniforms, their laughter mingling with the chatter of citizens eager to believe in renewal. But in the grand halls of the city, another story unfolded. Delegates from across the world gathered to shape the peace, their carriages rolling up to palaces and hotels lit by flickering gas lamps. Inside, beneath chandeliers, decisions were being made that would reach far beyond the gilded walls. For while the people hoped for reconciliation, the politicians often sought retribution. In the countryside, winter passed slowly. Farmers returned to fields still scarred by trenches and craters. Some harvested crops that grew wild among barbed wire and rusting shells, while others dug cautiously, fearful of unexploded bombs that still lurked beneath the soil. Children played in abandoned bunkers, their laughter echoing where once there had been cries of pain. Life tried to continue, but the war remained etched into the very landscape, a constant reminder of what had been endured. As 1919 arrived, the world stood in a delicate balance. On one hand, there was hope for a peace that would last, for a generation that might never know the horror of war again. On the other, there was unease that the peace might prove fragile, that old rivalries and new wounds might one day reignite. The silence after the guns was filled with both promise and peril. Now, close your eyes and picture yourself in that moment, in Paris, as winter softens into spring. The streets are alive with carriages and the clip of hooves on cobblestones. The Seine glimmers beneath the moonlight, carrying the city's secrets as it has for centuries. Inside the gilded halls of the Palace of Versailles, pens are poised over parchment, ready to carve into history the terms of a fragile peace. Outside, lamps glow in the mist, and the city breathes with anticipation. The war has ended, but the peace is yet to be written, and within that silence, the fate of the world quietly waits. Picture yourself walking through the manicured gardens of the Palace of Versailles on a warm June day in 1919. The air is fragrant with blooming roses, and the fountains sparkle under the sun, their steady trickle masking the quiet murmurs of anticipation that fill the grand halls inside. Beyond the gilded gates, the world waits anxiously, for within those walls, the victors of the Great War are about to write the terms of peace. Versailles, once a symbol of royal splendor, has become the stage on which the future of Europe will be decided. Yet beneath the polished marble floors and shimmering chandeliers lies tension, mistrust, and the heavy burden of revenge. The conference in Paris had brought together delegates from dozens of nations, but at its heart, power rested in the hands of just a few men. Known as the Big Four, they were Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd, George of Britain, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Each carried with him not only the hopes of his people, but also the scars of the war and the weight of political expectation. Clemenceau, stern and unyielding, sought security for France above all, determined that Germany would never again have the means to threaten his country. Lloyd George balanced between public demand for retribution and his own recognition that too harsh a settlement might destabilize Europe. Wilson, idealistic yet increasingly isolated, pressed for his 14 points and a vision of a new world order guided by justice rather than vengeance. Orlando, though less influential, fought for Italy's promised gains, eager to secure prestige for his nation. The defeated powers were not invited to shape the treaty. Instead, they waited outside the chambers, powerless, their fate discussed without their voice. For Germany, the humiliation of exclusion was profound. They had asked for peace on the basis of Wilson's principles, only to discover that the reality would be far harsher. When the German delegation was finally summoned to Versailles, they entered the Hall of Mirrors to face a document that would not only punish their nation, but haunt it for decades. The treaty demanded that Germany accept full responsibility for the war under what became known as the War Guilt Clause. It stripped the country of its colonies, reduced its military to a fraction of its former size, and imposed territorial losses that carved away parts of its borders. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France, while Poland was granted access to the sea through what became the Polish Corridor, dividing Germany's eastern territories. The Rhineland was to be demilitarized, a buffer zone meant to protect France, but also a wound to German pride. Perhaps most devastating of all were the reparations, vast financial payments meant to compensate for the destruction of the war. The figure, though not finalized until later, would prove crippling, a constant reminder to Germans that their country was burdened with debt and disgrace. Factories, mines, and railways were demanded as part of the settlement, and for many Germans, the treaty felt less like peace and more like punishment. The reaction in Germany was immediate and bitter. Newspapers denounced the terms as a diktat, a dictated peace forced upon a nation too weak to resist. Politicians debated fiercely whether to sign, some arguing that to do so would be to betray the country, while others feared the Allied threat of invasion if they refused. In the end, the German government capitulated. On June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand had ignited the war, the treaty was signed. The irony was not lost on those who remembered the spark that had set the world aflame. Across the victorious nations, reactions were mixed. In France, many felt vindicated. Clemenceau declared that the treaty delivered the justice his people demanded. Yet even among the French, there were voices of doubt, whispers that the peace might not endure. In Britain, Lloyd George returned home claiming success, but he too worried privately that the severity of the terms might sow the seeds of future conflict. In the United States, Wilson faced resistance from his own Senate, where suspicion of entangling alliances made ratification of the treaty and membership in the League of Nations a bitter struggle. For Italy, disappointment loomed as many of the promises made during the war went unfulfilled, fueling resentment and a sense of betrayal. For the ordinary people of Europe, the treaty was less a distant document and more an uncertain turning point. In Germany, families who had already endured hunger during the war now braced for even harsher times. Farmers worried about losing land, workers feared factory closures, and veterans felt their sacrifices had been dishonoured. In France and Belgium, where towns and villages still lay in ruins, there was hope that reparations would rebuild what had been lost. Yet time would show that money could not so easily heal the deeper wounds of grief and resentment. As the months passed, the treaty's consequences became clearer. Germany's new Weimar Republic, already fragile, struggled to manage the anger of its citizens. Political extremists on both the left and right seized the moment, denouncing the government as weak and illegitimate for accepting such humiliating terms. Demonstrations filled the streets, and whispers of revolution echoed once again. The treaty, intended to secure peace, had instead created fertile ground for instability. Meanwhile, the League of Nations was born out of Wilson's vision, a symbol of hope that nations might resolve disputes without resorting to war. Its headquarters opened in Geneva, and delegates gathered to debate issues of borders, health, and disarmament. Yet from the very beginning, the League lacked the support it desperately needed. The absence of the United States, whose Senate refused to ratify the treaty, weakened the organization profoundly. Without American power, and with Germany and Russia initially excluded, the League was left with limited influence. It was a fragile pillar upon which to rest the dream of everlasting peace. Now, picture the Hall of Mirrors once more, its gilded walls reflecting not only light, but also the heavy weight of history. Imagine the ink drying on the treaty, the scratch of pens echoing like faint whispers in the still air. Outside, the gardens bloom, the fountains dance, and yet, beneath the surface there is unease. For all its grandeur, Versailles had not secured the peace it promised. Instead, it had drawn lines on a map that cut deep into national pride, lines that in time would bleed again. As evening falls over the palace, the glow of lanterns bathes the marble corridors, and the delegates retreat to their quarters, satisfied or disillusioned in equal measure. The treaty lies sealed, its words heavy with consequence. Beyond the palace gates, ordinary people return to their lives, some hopeful, some resentful, all uncertain of what lies ahead. The shadows cast by Versailles stretch long into the night, shadows that will only grow darker as the years unfold. Picture yourself strolling through a European city in the early 1920s. The cobbled streets are alive once more with chatter, cafes hum with voices, and the glow of lamplight spills warmly onto pavements that only a few years earlier had echoed with the tramp of marching boots. At first glance, peace seems to have returned. The guns are silent, armies are disbanded, and families are reunited. Yet just beneath the surface, the wounds of the Great War remain open, the scars visible not only on ruined buildings, but also in the eyes of those who lived through it. The world is trying to move forward, but the ground on which it walks is fragile. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, had promised peace, but left bitterness instead. In Germany, the terms of the treaty weighed heavily. Reparations payments loomed like storm clouds over the economy, and national pride felt trampled under foreign dictates. The new Weimar Republic, fragile from birth, struggled to hold itself together. Many Germans looked at their leaders with suspicion, blaming them for signing what they called the Diktat of Versailles. Extremist voices grew louder, promising to restore dignity and strength, while ordinary families battled inflation and shortages. Elsewhere, Europe was reshaped in ways that created both hope and turmoil. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was gone, replaced by a mosaic of new nations: Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, and Yugoslavia. For some, independence was a dream fulfilled, the chance to govern themselves for the first time. But with independence came disputes over borders, resources, and identity. Where once emperors ruled, now politicians argued, and the new lines drawn on maps often left minorities stranded within unfamiliar states. National pride bloomed, but so too did resentment and mistrust. In the East, Russia had been transformed by revolution. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, had seized power in 1917, pulling Russia out of the war and plunging it into civil conflict. By 1922, the Soviet Union was officially born, its red flag flying over Moscow, and its leaders declaring a new vision for the world. To many in the West, this was deeply unsettling. Communism, with its promise of worldwide revolution, was seen as a threat to traditional order and private property. To others, it was a beacon of hope for workers and peasants long oppressed. The presence of a new ideological power on Europe's doorstep added to the fragile balance. Amid this shifting landscape, the League of Nations began its work. Established in 1920, it was intended to be the guardian of peace, a forum where disputes could be resolved without resorting to war. Its grand chambers in Geneva held debates about borders, disarmament, and humanitarian issues. At times, it succeeded, mediating small conflicts in places like Finland and resolving disputes over territories. Yet from the start, its limitations were clear. Without the United States, and with major powers often unwilling to enforce decisions, the League lacked the strength to deter serious aggression. Still, for many, it symbolized a fragile hope that humanity might learn from its mistakes. While politics swirled, daily life for ordinary people carried on in new and unexpected ways. The 1920s began to shimmer with cultural change. Jazz music drifted across dance halls in Paris and Berlin. Cinema became a popular escape, with silent films drawing crowds eager for distraction from hardship. Women, who had taken on new roles during the war, began to claim greater independence. In some countries, they gained the right to vote, and in cities, the image of the modern woman, short-haired, self-assured, and stylish, became a symbol of a world trying to reinvent itself. It was as though, in the aftermath of destruction, society was experimenting with renewal. Yet the undercurrents of instability were never far away. In 1920, violence erupted in Germany when extremist groups clashed with government forces. In 1923, the fragile Weimar Republic faced one of its greatest crises. Unable to keep up with reparation payments, Germany defaulted, and French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, the industrial heartland of Germany. Workers responded with strikes, grinding production to a halt, and the economy spiraled into chaos. Inflation, already a problem, soared into the unimaginable. Banknotes became worthless, wheelbarrows were used to carry wages, and life savings vanished overnight. Families queued for bread, with pockets full of money that could barely buy a crust. For the German people, humiliation deepened into despair. This despair gave fuel to those who promised change. Among them was a fiery speaker named Adolf Hitler, whose attempted coup in Munich in 1923, the Beer Hall Putsch, failed, but whose ideas found growing audiences in a nation hungry for pride and stability. Though his movement was small at the time, it revealed how fragile Germany's democracy truly was, and how easily it could be shaken by voices of anger. Elsewhere, Italy was undergoing its own transformation. Disillusioned by what it had gained from the war, the nation turned toward Benito Mussolini and his fascist party. By 1922, Mussolini had marched on Rome, demanding power, and the government, unwilling to risk conflict, handed it to him. With his black-shirted followers, Mussolini established a new kind of rule: authoritarian, nationalistic, and theatrical. Italy became the first European nation to embrace fascism, a model that would soon inspire others. For those living through these years, life was a blend of hope and anxiety. In bustling capitals, cafes buzzed with debate about politics and art, while in the countryside, farmers tilled soil that still bore the scars of shells and trenches. Children played in streets where bombed-out buildings stood as silent reminders of the past. In many ways, it was a time of transition when people longed to forget the horrors of war, yet could not escape their shadow. Now, close your eyes and imagine yourself in Berlin in 1923. The city streets are filled with posters advertising cabaret shows. Cafes glow with music and laughter. Yet outside banks, desperate queues stretch along pavements as people clutch stacks of worthless notes. In the distance, speeches echo in beer halls, voices rising with promises of restored greatness. The city is alive, vibrant, but trembling, its foundations uncertain. Across Europe, from Paris to Rome, from Warsaw to Moscow, the same fragile balance holds. Peace has returned, but it is delicate, uncertain, and already beginning to crack. As twilight settles over the continent, the lamps of a new era flicker to life. The world breathes in the promise of recovery, even as it exhales the smoke of lingering discontent. For in these years, between 1920 and 1923, history is not yet written in fire, but in whispers and shadows. The world is changing quietly, and with each shift, the fragile peace grows just a little more precarious. Picture the evening streets of Munich in November 1923. The lamps glow faintly in the mist, the air carries the smell of damp cobblestones, and in a crowded beer hall, the sound of raised voices echoes beneath vaulted ceilings. A young man with piercing eyes and a commanding tone speaks of betrayal, of humiliation, of a Germany brought low by enemies within and without. His words stir anger and passion, and though his attempted uprising will fail within days, his name, Adolf Hitler, will not be forgotten. These years, from 1923 to 1929, were years of fragile stability and simmering unrest, when new movements rose from the ruins of war, carrying with them the promises of both renewal and destruction. The early 1920s had pushed Germany to the brink. The occupation of the Ruhr and the madness of hyperinflation left the country gasping for stability. When Hitler and his fellow conspirators attempted the beer hall putsch in 1923, their failure seemed to confirm that extremist movements were destined to remain on the fringes. Hitler himself was imprisoned, and during his confinement, he dictated his vision in a book that would later become infamous, Mein Kampf. At the time, however, few outside radical circles took much notice. Yet even in defeat, the seeds of something darker had been planted. As Germany staggered, the world sought to steady it. In 1924, the Dawes Plan, brokered largely by American financiers, restructured reparations payments and stabilized the German currency. Loans from the United States poured into German banks, fueling recovery and restoring some semblance of normalcy. The cafes of Berlin once again thrummed with music and laughter. Artists and writers flocked to the city, where cabaret halls glittered with performances, and experimental films pushed the boundaries of art. It was the so-called Golden Twenties, a period when Germany, though politically fragile, became a center of cultural vibrancy. Yet this glitter rested on shaky ground, dependent on foreign loans, and vulnerable to every tremor in the global economy. While Germany flirted with stability, Italy had already embraced a new political experiment. Benito Mussolini, having seized power in 1922, tightened his grip on the country throughout the decade. His black-shirted followers patrolled the streets, suppressing dissent, while Mussolini himself staged grand parades, speeches, and rituals designed to bind Italians to his vision of a strong, united, and expanding nation. Fascism was more than politics. It was theatre, a performance meant to inspire loyalty through spectacle. For some, it offered order after years of chaos. For others, it was the first chilling glimpse of authoritarianism in modern Europe. Across the continent, similar movements stirred. Nationalists, fascists, and communists clashed in the streets of cities from Vienna to Madrid. In Eastern Europe, newly created states grappled with internal divisions. Hungary, stripped of much of its territory after the war, simmered with resentment. Poland, reborn after more than a century of partitions, faced conflicts with neighbours and questions of identity. Democracy was fragile in these lands, often challenged by leaders who promised strength in exchange for liberty. Beyond Europe, the world was changing too. In the United States, the Roaring Twenties were in full swing. Skyscrapers rose above New York City, jazz bands filled smoky clubs, and consumer goods flooded the market. Automobiles rolled off assembly lines, radios carried voices into homes, and a sense of prosperity seemed unshakable. Yet this prosperity, much like Germany's, was built on credit and speculation, a fragile illusion of endless growth. Few could imagine how swiftly it would collapse. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Lenin's death in 1924 left a struggle for power that would shape the future of the world. Among the contenders was Joseph Stalin, a quiet yet ruthless operator who gradually outmaneuvered his rivals. By the late 1920s, Stalin had consolidated control, ushering in an era of rapid industrialization and brutal repression. To the West, the Soviet Union represented both fear and fascination, a society attempting to build a new order on the ashes of the old, but doing so through methods that would cause immense suffering. For ordinary people, these years carried a strange mixture of relief and unease. In Paris, the scars of war were slowly being repaired. Streets bustled with life, the cafes were full, and artists painted visions of new futures. In London, the government wrestled with economic challenges, but the sense of imperial stability lingered. In Berlin, despite political turbulence, there was a sense that life was beginning to shine again, that the horrors of the past might finally be giving way to something brighter. Yet beneath this surface optimism, the memory of war remained sharp, and the political divisions never truly faded. Cultural life mirrored the contradictions of the age. Writers like Erich Maria Remarque captured the disillusionment of a generation with works such as All Quiet on the Western Front, reminding readers that the war's ghosts still lingered. Artists in the Bauhaus movement reimagined design, while jazz musicians brought rhythms from America to European dance floors. Cinema, too, flourished, with films like Fritz Lang's Metropolis portraying both the wonder and the anxiety of modernity. It was a world trying to reinvent itself, yet haunted by shadows. By the later 1920s, diplomacy seemed to offer hope that peace might endure. The Locarno Treaties of 1925 eased tensions between Germany and its Western neighbours, with agreements to respect borders and renounce violence. Germany was admitted into the League of Nations in 1926, a sign that it was slowly being welcomed back into the international community. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, signed by dozens of nations, declared war itself to be illegal. For a moment, it seemed as though the horrors of the Great War had truly taught the world a lasting lesson. Yet these hopeful gestures existed alongside growing discontent. In Italy, Mussolini's regime grew more oppressive. In Germany, extremist parties still lurked, waiting for opportunity. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's consolidation of power signaled that repression would deepen. And in the financial markets of New York, a storm was quietly building, one that would soon send shockwaves across the world. Now, close your eyes and picture yourself in a Berlin cabaret in 1928. The lights are dim, smoke curls upward, and a pianist plays while dancers whirl across the stage. The audience laughs, applauds, and sips wine, eager to forget the troubles outside. Yet, as you step into the cool night air, the city hums with contradictions, vibrant and modern, yet restless and divided. Across Europe, the same sense of unease lingers, as though the continent is balancing on a knife's edge between recovery and collapse. As twilight falls on the decade, the streets glow with promise, but the air is heavy with unspoken tension. The new movements rising across Europe are shaping the future, their voices louder each year. For now, the world dances to the rhythms of the 20s, but in the shadows, a darker tune is beginning to play. Imagine yourself standing on Wall Street in New York City in October 1929. The autumn air is crisp, but the atmosphere is tense. Crowds gather outside the stock exchange, their voices anxious, their faces pale. Brokers rush back and forth with frantic steps, the once celebratory hum of prosperity replaced by fear. On the ticker tape machines, numbers plunge downward, faster and faster, as fortunes evaporate in an instant. What began as a financial shock in one city soon spreads like a storm across oceans, shaking the world to its core. The Great Depression has begun, and with it, the fragile certainties of the 1920s collapse into dust. The Roaring Twenties had been built on illusions of endless growth. In the United States, production had soared, consumer goods filled homes, and stock markets seemed to climb without limit. Banks lent freely, and investors speculated recklessly. Yet beneath the glittering surface lay deep imbalances, unequal wealth, fragile credit, and overproduction. When the bubble burst in October 1929, the consequences rippled across the globe. By the early 1930s, millions were out of work, savings were wiped out, and despair settled like a heavy fog over once thriving societies. In America, the Depression transformed bustling cities into places of quiet desperation. Soup kitchens lined the streets, offering meager meals to the unemployed. Farmers watched helplessly as prices for crops collapsed, their produce sometimes worth less than the cost of transport to market. In the Midwest, drought and dust storms compounded misery, driving families from their land. The image of long queues of men in worn coats, waiting silently for bread, became a haunting symbol of the era. But the shock was not confined to the United States. Because American loans had propped up European recovery after the First World War, the crisis spread quickly. In Germany, where prosperity had rested on foreign credit, the impact was devastating. Businesses closed, banks failed, and unemployment soared. By 1932, nearly 1 in 3 Germans was without work. Families huddled in cold apartments, unable to afford fuel. Children went hungry. The fragile democracy of the Weimar Republic, already mistrusted by many, seemed powerless to respond. The despair created fertile ground for political extremism. On one side, communists promised revolution, drawing strength from the Soviet Union's example. On the other, nationalists and fascists promised order, strength, and revival. Among them was Adolf Hitler, whose Nazi party, once a fringe movement, began to attract masses of desperate supporters. His speeches, filled with fury against Versailles, against Jews, against communists, resonated with those who felt betrayed and abandoned. In the election of 1930, the Nazis surged from obscurity to become one of the largest parties in the Reichstag. The storm was gathering, fueled not by prosperity but by despair. Elsewhere in Europe, the crisis hit with equal force. In Britain, unemployment rose sharply, particularly in industrial regions of the north. Coal miners, shipbuilders, and factory workers found themselves without work. Their communities plunged into poverty. In France, the Depression arrived later but caused political instability, fueling divisions between left and right. In Eastern Europe, fragile economies teetered, pushing governments toward authoritarianism as they struggled to maintain control. Across the continent, democracy seemed less capable of delivering solutions, and strong leaders who promised certainty grew more appealing. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the Depression had a different effect. Shielded by its state-controlled economy, the USSR did not suffer the same collapse as capitalist countries. Instead, Stalin used the crisis abroad as proof that communism was the future, even as his policies of forced collectivization and rapid industrialization caused famine and suffering at home. To some outside observers, the Soviet model seemed resilient, offering an alternative to the chaos of free markets. To others, it was a chilling reminder of the costs of authoritarian control. In the United States, the initial response to the crisis faltered. President Herbert Hoover urged patience and voluntary cooperation, but his policies seemed insufficient against the scale of the disaster. By 1932, as banks continued to fail and unemployment climbed to record levels, frustration turned into anger. Shanty towns known as Hoovervilles sprang up on the edges of cities, makeshift shelters built from scrap wood and metal. Families huddled inside against the cold, their dreams of prosperity shattered. For those living through these years, daily life was filled with quiet struggle. In Germany, mothers lined up for soup, fathers searched endlessly for work, and children played with homemade toys, their laughter masking hunger. In Britain, men marched in hunger demonstrations, their worn boots clattering on the cobblestones. In America, families gathered around radios, clinging to voices of reassurance even as cupboards emptied. The Depression was not just an economic collapse, it was a collapse of confidence, of certainty, of belief in the systems that had once seemed unshakable. Yet even in this bleakness, moments of resilience appeared. Communities came together to share what little they had. Churches and charities offered aid. Families leaned on one another, finding strength in solidarity. And in the realm of politics, new leaders emerged with promises to lift nations from despair. In the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt campaigned on a New Deal, offering hope that government could actively intervene to restore prosperity. In Germany, Hitler and the Nazis offered a darker promise to tear down the existing order and build a new one on the foundations of nationalism and hatred. The years from 1929 to 1932 were years of silence and struggle, when the laughter of the 1920s gave way to the quiet desperation of the 1930s. The Depression did not merely wound economies, it reshaped politics, societies, and the course of history. It weakened democracies, strengthened authoritarian movements, and set the stage for decisions that would reverberate through the next decade. Now, close your eyes and imagine a winter night in Berlin in 1931. Snow drifts softly onto the rooftops, muffling the sound of footsteps in the street. In one apartment, a family huddles around a flickering stove, their dinner sparse, their conversation subdued. Outside, posters cover the walls, one bearing the red flag of communism, another the swastika of the rising Nazi party. The city is restless, torn between visions of the future, uncertain of which path it will follow. Across the world, the same unease hangs in the air. The certainties of yesterday have crumbled, and the choices of tomorrow grow heavier with each passing day. As dawn approaches, the world stirs uneasily, its dreams clouded by fear and longing. The Great Depression has changed everything. The fragile balance of the post-war years has shattered, and in the vacuum left behind, new powers and new ideologies are rising. The peace so carefully crafted after the First World War is dissolving, and the road ahead leads into darker shadows. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Berlin on a grey January morning in 1933. The air is damp, the cobblestones slick with rain, and the city hums with a restless energy. Posters cling to walls, their colours fading in the winter drizzle, bearing bold slogans and symbols of rival parties. Some bear the red flag of the communists, others the black, white and red swastika of the National Socialists. Crowds gather in cafes and beer halls, their voices animated with debate, their tempers flaring with each passing day. Germany stands at a crossroads, battered by depression, divided by politics, and uncertain of what future lies ahead. It is here, in this fragile moment, that Adolf Hitler's path to power reaches its climax. The years leading up to 1933 had left Germany exhausted. The Great Depression had devastated the economy, leaving millions unemployed and hungry. The fragile Weimar Republic, plagued by political infighting, seemed incapable of solving the crisis. Extremist movements on both the left and right gained strength, offering bold promises to desperate people. Among them, the Nazi Party emerged as a force unlike any other. Hitler, once dismissed as a radical agitator, had transformed himself into a national figure, his speeches stirring emotions with their mixture of rage, hope, and vision. By the early 1930s, the Nazis had become one of the largest parties in the Reichstag. They promised to restore Germany's pride, to tear up the hated Treaty of Versailles, to rebuild the economy, and to crush communism. Their propaganda was relentless, filling newspapers, posters, and radio broadcasts with images of strength and unity. The swastika became a symbol of defiance against humiliation, a banner under which millions rallied. For many Germans, weary of instability and despair, the Nazis seemed to offer certainty and direction. Yet Hitler's rise was not inevitable. In the elections of November 1932, the Nazi Party actually lost seats, slipping from its peak. It seemed for a brief moment that their momentum might falter, but behind the scenes, political maneuvering would hand Hitler what ballots alone had not achieved. Conservative elites, fearing the growing strength of the communists and hoping to control Hitler for their own purposes, pushed for his appointment as Chancellor. They believed they could use his popularity while keeping him in check. It was a grave miscalculation. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, the aging war hero, reluctantly appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. That evening, torchlit parades filled the streets of Berlin. Flames flickered against the night sky as crowds marched, their chants echoing between buildings. For some, it was a moment of triumph, the beginning of renewal. For others, it was a moment of unease, a sense that something ominous had begun. Few could know how swiftly the balance of power would shift. Once in office, Hitler moved with ruthless efficiency. Within weeks, the Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided a pretext to clamp down on opposition. Civil liberties were suspended, communist leaders were arrested, and fear spread through the streets. In March, the Enabling Act was passed, granting Hitler the power to rule by decree. The fragile democracy of Weimar was dismantled piece by piece, replaced by a dictatorship that consolidated all authority in his hands. Propaganda played a central role in this transformation. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated campaigns that glorified Hitler as Germany's savior. Posters portrayed him as a man of the people, while rallies showcased unity and strength. The radio, once a novelty, became a powerful tool for spreading the Nazi message into every home. Children were drawn into Hitler Youth organizations, their loyalty cultivated from an early age. Step by step, German society was reshaped to reflect the vision of the new regime. Opponents quickly discovered that resistance was perilous. Political parties were banned, trade unions dissolved, and critics silenced. The first concentration camps were established, not yet the centres of mass extermination they would later become, but places where political prisoners were imprisoned and terrorised. The atmosphere of fear grew steadily, as neighbours hesitated to speak openly, and loyalty was rewarded while dissent was crushed. For ordinary Germans, the changes were swift and disorienting. Some welcomed the sense of order, the parades, the revival of national pride. Others recoiled in private, uncertain how to navigate a society where suspicion lurked in every conversation. Unemployment began to decline as the government launched public works projects and rearmament programs, but these improvements came at the cost of freedom. It was a trade many were willing to accept, believing that prosperity mattered more than liberty. Internationally, Hitler's rise was watched with caution. Some leaders dismissed him as a temporary figure, a radical who would be moderated by the responsibilities of office. Others worried quietly but hesitated to act, scarred by the memory of the Great War and reluctant to confront Germany again. The League of Nations, already weakened, offered little more than concern. In capitals across Europe, a dangerous complacency took root. Yet, for those who stood in Berlin that year, the change was unmistakable. The city, once a place of debate and diversity, grew uniform in its displays of loyalty. Swastikas fluttered from buildings, torchlight parades marched through the night, and the image of Hitler stared from every wall. A new chapter in Germany's history had begun, and with it, the path to war drew ever closer. Now, close your eyes and picture the streets of Berlin on the evening of January 30th, 1933. Torches blaze in the hands of marchers, their flames reflected in the wet cobblestones. The air is filled with chants and the rhythmic tramp of boots. Above it all, the Reich Chancellery glows in the night, its windows lit as Hitler steps into his new role. The city seems alive with energy, yet beneath the spectacle lies a chill, as though the future itself has darkened. The fragile democracy of Weimar has vanished, replaced by the shadow of dictatorship. The silence after the guns of 1918 has grown into a storm, and though few yet realize it, the world has entered a new and perilous age. Imagine yourself sitting in a quiet cafe in Paris in the mid-1930s. The air smells faintly of roasted coffee and tobacco smoke, and outside the window, the bustle of the city moves along as though the world is calm and ordinary. Yet within the newspapers spread across the marble tables lies a different story. Headlines speak of Germany rearming, of Italy marching into Africa, of Spain torn apart by civil war. Customers glance at the papers, frown, and return to their conversations. Across Europe, life carries on, but unease lingers in the background like the faint rumble of distant thunder. The world is watching, uncertain, hesitant, hoping against hope that peace might endure. When Hitler consolidated power in 1933, his first steps were both bold and calculated. Germany withdrew from the League of Nations and the World Disarmament Conference, signaling that it no longer accepted the constraints imposed by Versailles. It was a dramatic move, yet it did not provoke decisive action from other powers. Britain and France, weary from the memory of the Great War and facing their own economic struggles, preferred caution over confrontation. The United States, distant and focused inward, watched, but did not intervene. The silence of the international community gave Hitler room to maneuver. In 1935, Germany openly announced the rebuilding of its armed forces. Conscription was reintroduced, and new aircraft and tanks rolled off assembly lines in defiance of the treaty. The following year, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone meant to protect France from invasion. It was a gamble. Hitler's generals admitted that if France had responded with force, Germany would have been forced to retreat. Yet no such response came. French leaders hesitated, unwilling to risk war without British support, while Britain's government reasoned that Germany was merely reclaiming what rightfully belonged to it. For Hitler, the lack of resistance was a triumph, emboldening him to press further. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe, authoritarianism spread. In Italy, Mussolini sought to expand his empire. In 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia, one of the last independent nations in Africa. The campaign was brutal, with modern weapons unleashed against poorly equipped defenders. The League of Nations condemned the invasion and imposed sanctions, but they were half-hearted and ineffective. Britain and France, eager to keep Mussolini as a potential ally against Germany, avoided firm action. Ethiopia fell, and with it, the credibility of the League collapsed. To many, it seemed clear that aggression could proceed unchecked. At the same time, Spain descended into civil war. In 1936, a military uprising led by General Francisco Franco sought to overthrow the Spanish Republic. The conflict quickly became a proxy battle between ideologies. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany poured in support for Franco's nationalists, while the Soviet Union backed the Republicans. Volunteers from across the world, including Britain, France, and the United States, traveled to Spain to fight for the cause of democracy. The war became a testing ground for new tactics and weapons. German bombers devastated the town of Guernica in 1937, their attack immortalized in Pablo Picasso's haunting painting. Though Spain's civil war was a tragedy in itself, it also foreshadowed the greater conflict soon to come. In the Soviet Union, Stalin watched events unfold with suspicion and calculation. He strengthened his grip at home through purges that eliminated perceived rivals and instilled fear. Abroad, he sought alliances but mistrusted the Western democracies, fearing they would prefer to appease Hitler rather than resist him. His caution would shape the choices made in the years to come, as the balance of power in Europe grew ever more precarious. For the ordinary citizens of Europe, these years were filled with contradictions. In London, people crowded into cinemas, enjoying the new age of sound films, their laughter echoing through theatres even as newspapers reported on German rearmament. In Paris, artists painted, writers argued in cafes, and lovers strolled along the Seine, yet conversations often turned uneasily to politics and war. In Berlin, the Nazi regime tightened its grip. Streets filled with swastika banners. School children were taught loyalty to the Führer, and dissenters were silenced. Life carried on, but beneath the routine of daily existence, tension grew like a tightening string. International diplomacy during these years often resembled theatre more than resolve. Leaders met in conferences, issued declarations, and signed pacts promising peace. Yet each agreement was undermined by hesitation and mistrust. The stressor front of 1935, meant to unite Britain, France, and Italy against German aggression, collapsed almost as soon as it was formed. The League of Nations continued to meet in Geneva, but its words carried little weight. Aggression was met not with force, but with appeals, and each failure emboldened the aggressors further. By 1936, the sense of foreboding was unmistakable. Hitler's boldness had grown. Mussolini had expanded his reach, and Spain was aflame. Yet the world, still haunted by the memory of the trenches of 1914 to 1918, remained reluctant to act. In Britain, pacifist movements gained strength, their marches calling for peace at any price. In France, governments wavered, divided between fear of Germany and fear of communism. Across the Atlantic, the United States clung to isolation, passing neutrality acts to keep out of foreign entanglements. The world watched, but the world did not intervene. Now, close your eyes and imagine a summer evening in Geneva, where delegates gather at the League of Nations. The lake shimmers in the twilight, its waters calm and still, while inside the conference hall, Voices debate endlessly over words and principles. Outside, the mountains rise in serene silence, as though indifferent to the struggles of men. The delegates disperse into the night, their speeches written, their decisions timid. Far away, armies march, planes take flight, and bombs fall on villages. The world is watching, but watching is not enough. As night falls across Europe, the cafes of Paris still buzz, the theatres of London still glow, and the streets of Berlin still echo with chants of loyalty. Life seems ordinary, yet the fabric of peace is fraying thread by thread. Between 1933 and 1936, the storm has gathered strength, and though the world still hopes for calm, the horizon is already dark with clouds. The silence of inaction will not last forever, for history is moving steadily toward its breaking point. Imagine a spring morning in Vienna in 1938. The streets are alive with the sound of marching boots and cheering crowds. Swastika flags hang from windows, fluttering in the breeze, while church bells ring out as though celebrating a festival. Adolf Hitler has entered the city, greeted not with resistance but with rapture. For many Austrians, this is a moment of reunion, the long-anticipated Anschluss, the union of Austria with Germany. Yet beneath the orchestrated joy lies a quieter truth. A sovereign nation has been swallowed, its independence erased, and the world, once again, has chosen not to intervene. The years between 1936 and 1938 marked the moment when Hitler shifted from consolidating power within Germany to openly expanding beyond its borders. Each step was a gamble, each move a violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and yet, time after time, his boldness went unanswered. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 had emboldened him, teaching that the Western democracies lacked the will to resist. Now, he pressed further, pursuing both territorial ambition and ideological mission. Austria was the first great prize. The union of Germany and Austria had long been a dream for nationalists who believed in a greater German identity. Versailles had forbidden it, fearing that such a merger would strengthen Germany too much. But in March 1938, Hitler defied that restriction. Pressure was applied to Austria's government, and when resistance faltered, German troops crossed the border. To the world, the images broadcast were of jubilant crowds welcoming the soldiers, of flowers thrown before tanks, of Hitler standing triumphant in Vienna's Heldenplatz. But for many Austrians, particularly Jews and political opponents, the Anschluss brought fear and persecution. Overnight, the full machinery of the Nazi state extended into their lives. The reaction abroad was muted. Britain and France, though uneasy, did not act. Many in Britain saw the Anschluss as natural, a union of kindred peoples, and not worth risking war. France, weakened by political divisions, lacked both resolve and unity. The League of Nations, by now all but irrelevant, issued no meaningful response. Once more, Hitler's gamble had succeeded, but Austria was not the end. The next target lay further east, in Czechoslovakia. This young nation, created after the First World War, was a mosaic of peoples: Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Poles, and within its borders, over 3 million ethnic Germans living in the Sudetenland. Hitler declared that these Germans were oppressed, that they longed to join the Reich. His demands grew louder, his threats more ominous. Czechoslovakia was not weak. It had strong defences, a modern army, and alliances with France and the Soviet Union. Yet, as the crisis deepened in 1938, the question was not whether Czechoslovakia could defend itself, but whether its allies would stand beside it. France hesitated, unwilling to act without Britain. Britain, led by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, sought compromise. Haunted by the memory of 1914 and the carnage that had followed, Chamberlain was determined to avoid another war. He believed that by meeting Hitler's demands, peace could be preserved. Thus began the policy that came to be known as appeasement. Chamberlain travelled to Germany in September 1938, meeting Hitler face to face. The images of the British Prime Minister, umbrella in hand, flying across Europe in pursuit of peace, captured the world's imagination. After tense negotiations, the Munich Agreement was signed. Britain, France, Italy, and Germany agreed that the Sudetenland would be ceded to Germany. Czechoslovakia, whose fate was being decided, was not even present at the table. When Chamberlain returned to London, he was greeted with cheers. Standing before a jubilant crowd, he declared that the agreement had secured peace for our time. For many, exhausted by memories of the last war, it seemed a triumph of diplomacy. Bells rang, and newspapers printed headlines of relief, but beneath the celebrations lay unease. Winston Churchill, one of the few voices to speak out, warned that Britain had suffered a total and unmitigated defeat. His warnings, however, were drowned out by the clamour for peace. In Germany, Hitler was triumphant. Without firing a shot, he had gained not only the Sudetenland, but also the strategic fortifications that defended Czechoslovakia. It was a victory of intimidation, a demonstration that threats could yield rewards, and it confirmed what he already believed, that the Western democracies lacked the resolve to stop him. The road to further expansion lay open. For the people of Czechoslovakia, the Munich Agreement was a bitter betrayal. Their lands were partitioned without their consent, their defences dismantled, and their sovereignty diminished. In Prague, there was sorrow and anger, a sense of abandonment by supposed allies. The shadow of Germany loomed larger with each passing day, and the promise of safety proved fragile indeed. Meanwhile, in Italy, Mussolini basked in the role of mediator at Munich, presenting himself as a statesman even as his regime grew closer to Germany. The Rome-Berlin Axis, declared in 1936, had already bound the two powers together, and their cooperation deepened in the late 1930s. Together, they envisioned a new order in Europe, one built on expansion, conquest, and domination. For ordinary people across Europe, life in these years was marked by both hope and unease. In Britain, families celebrated the promise of peace, believing their leaders had spared them another war. In France, relief was tempered by quiet doubts. In Germany, the rallies grew ever larger, the propaganda ever more pervasive, the atmosphere increasingly suffused with pride and fear alike. In Austria and the Sudetenland, the Nazi system tightened its grip, with Jews, dissidents, and minorities subjected to persecution. The ordinary rhythms of daily life, children at school, families in markets, workers in factories, continued, but always under the shadow of looming change. Now, close your eyes and picture Munich in the autumn of 1938. The streets are lit with lanterns, the air is crisp with the first chill of the season, and inside grand halls, statesmen shake hands, their faces weary yet relieved. Outside, crowds cheer, believing peace has been secured. Yet, in the silence of the night, the ink dries on an agreement that sacrifices one nation to appease another. The city slumbers, but history does not rest, for even as the world breathes a sigh of relief, the seeds of war are already sown. As the year draws to a close, the illusion of peace lingers, fragile and fleeting. The policy of appeasement has bought time, but not security. In the quiet before the storm, Europe drifts further into peril, its leaders lulled by promises, its people clinging to hope. Yet the shadows lengthen, and the storm waits patiently just beyond the horizon. Imagine yourself in the city of Prague on a grey March morning in 1939. The cobblestone streets are quiet, but tension lingers in the air. Shopkeepers glance nervously at soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms, while the sound of boots echoes against the walls of the old town. German troops have marched into the heart of Czechoslovakia, not just the Sudetenland now, but Prague itself. The illusion of Munich has collapsed, and with it, the fragile hope that appeasement might preserve peace. The world watches again, but this time, even the optimists begin to sense that the abyss is near. The year 1938 had ended with promises of peace for our time, yet within months, Hitler shattered those promises. In March 1939, he broke his word and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. It was a bold and blatant move, revealing that his ambitions extended far beyond the unity of German-speaking peoples. This was conquest, pure and simple. For the first time, the excuse of self-determination could not disguise aggression. The mask slipped, and the true nature of Hitler's expansionist vision stood exposed. The reaction in Britain and France was shock, tinged with regret. The Munich Agreement, hailed as a triumph of diplomacy, was now revealed as a hollow victory. Public opinion shifted. No longer could Hitler be seen as a man with limited aims. He was now understood as a predator who would not stop until resisted. In London, Neville Chamberlain's government, still clinging to hopes of peace, began at last to rearm in earnest. In France, the divisions that had paralyzed politics gave way to a grim recognition. War might be unavoidable. Appeasement had run its course. Yet Hitler did not slow. His gaze turned eastward to Poland. The Polish corridor, created by Versailles to give Poland access to the sea, divided Germany's territory and left the city of Danzig under international control. For Hitler, this was unacceptable. He demanded that the corridor be returned and that Danzig be integrated into the Reich. Poland, backed now by Britain and France, refused. The lines were drawn, though war had not yet come. In the summer of 1939, Europe held its breath. Diplomats shuttled between capitals, alliances were tested, and the question loomed: who would stand with whom if war erupted? Britain and France gave guarantees to Poland, promising support in the event of attack. Yet in the east, Stalin watched warily. The Soviet Union, mistrustful of both Germany and the Western democracies, weighed its options. Secretly, negotiations with both sides took place, and in August 1939, the world was stunned by the announcement of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union seemed unthinkable. Two bitter ideological enemies, fascists and communists, bound together in agreement. Yet the logic was cold. Hitler secured his eastern flank, ensuring that Germany would not face a two-front war, while Stalin gained time to strengthen his military and territorial concessions in Eastern Europe. A secret protocol divided Poland and the Baltic states between the two powers, carving up lands that had no voice in the matter. It was a cynical arrangement, one that shocked the world and confirmed that the abyss was now inevitable. For ordinary Europeans, 1939 was a year of unease. In Britain, families began to prepare gas masks, distributing them to children in schools. In France, reservists quietly awaited mobilization orders. In Germany, rallies grew ever more fervent, the propaganda machine whipping up national pride and obedience. In Poland, people carried on with their lives as best they could, though whispers of German demands and Soviet maneuvers hung in the air like storm clouds. Across the continent, there was a sense that time was running out, that peace was fraying with every passing week. Yet even as the political crisis deepened, daily life offered fleeting moments of normalcy. In Paris, lovers still strolled along the Seine, cafes buzzed with late-night conversations, and theatres performed to full houses. In London, newspapers debated the crisis, but cricket matches still filled the summer afternoons. In Berlin, cinemas showed newsreels of triumph and unity, while ordinary people went to work, married, raised children. Life went on, as if the world were determined to squeeze out the last drops of peace before the storm. But the atmosphere was tense. In Poland, rumours of invasion spread. though many hoped that Britain and France's guarantees would deter Germany. In Britain, children practiced air raid drills, crouching beneath desks as sirens wailed. Gas masks were tested, shelters dug, and yet the hope lingered that perhaps, somehow, war could still be avoided. Leaders spoke cautiously, diplomats hurried, but the momentum was unstoppable. The summer drew into late August, and the world seemed to grow still, as though waiting. Farmers harvested their fields, children played in sunlit parks, but in barracks and armories, weapons were polished, soldiers drilled, and trains stood ready to move. On the night of August 23rd, as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, the stars above Europe glimmered indifferently. Beneath them, history shifted irrevocably. Now, close your eyes and picture that moment, the ink drying on the pact in Moscow, the smiles of men who distrusted each other profoundly, yet bound themselves in convenience. In Berlin, Hitler exhaled with relief, his path to Poland cleared. In London and Paris, the news spread with dread, leaders realizing that their worst fears had been confirmed. In Warsaw, people walked the streets unaware that their country had been secretly divided, their fate sealed by hands far away. As night fell on Europe in the late summer of 1939, the abyss lay open before it. Appeasement had failed, diplomacy had collapsed, and trust between nations was gone. Only one step remained, a step that would plunge the world once more into war. The silence before the storm was almost unbearable. The trains were ready, the armies mobilized, the speeches written. The world waited in hushed suspense, poised on the very edge of catastrophe. Soon, the silence would be shattered. Imagine a dawn in late summer, the 1st of September 1939, as the sun rises over the Polish countryside. Mist clings to the fields, roosters call from village farms, and the scent of damp soil hangs in the morning air. For a moment, it seems an ordinary day, quiet and unhurried. But in the distance, the deep rumble of engines breaks the stillness. Soon, the horizon is filled with dark shapes, tanks rolling across the fields, trucks laden with soldiers, aircraft roaring overhead. The invasion of Poland has begun, the spark has been struck, and the world is about to be engulfed in fire once more. At 4:45 a.m., German forces launched their assault. From the north, south and west, troops surged across the border, while the Luftwaffe bombed Polish airfields, railways, and cities. The strategy was swift and brutal, a new form of warfare the Germans called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It combined speed, surprise, and overwhelming force, designed to shatter an opponent before they could respond. For Poland, despite its bravery, the scale of the attack was overwhelming. Within hours, the country's skies were filled with German planes, and its roads churned with advancing tanks. The world reacted with shock, though perhaps not surprise. For months, the possibility of war had hung in the air, yet when it arrived, it carried a finality that left no doubt. Hitler had crossed the line, not with demands or negotiations, but with invasion. The question was no longer if the Western powers would act, but when. In London, news of the attack reached Downing Street swiftly. Neville Chamberlain, who had spent the past year striving to preserve peace, now faced the truth that diplomacy had failed. Britain had given its word to defend Poland, and honour demanded action. In France too, leaders understood that they could not stand aside. The guarantees made earlier in the year had been clear. To abandon Poland now would mean abandoning credibility altogether. Yet even in those first days, hesitation lingered. For 2 days after the invasion began, Britain and France demanded that Germany withdraw. Messages were sent, ultimatums delivered, while Polish cities burned under German bombs. In Warsaw, civilians huddled in basements as sirens wailed, children clung to mothers, and fathers dug trenches in gardens and squares. The world was waiting, poised between silence and storm. On September 3rd, Britain's ultimatum expired. At 11:15 a.m., Chamberlain addressed the nation by radio, his voice, solemn and measured, carried into the homes across the country. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note. "I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently, this country is at war with Germany." Across Britain, families listened in silence, some with dread, others with grim determination. In France too, the declaration followed. The Second World War had begun. For ordinary people, the news carried both fear and familiarity. Only 21 years had passed since the last war had ended, and many still remembered its horrors vividly. In Britain, gas masks were distributed, blackout curtains hung, and shelters prepared. Children were evacuated from London, clutching small suitcases and identity tags as they boarded trains to the countryside. In France, mobilization orders filled the streets with soldiers once more, uniforms mingling with the memories of fathers and brothers lost in the last conflict. In Poland, there was no time for preparation, only endurance, as families fled their homes or sought refuge where they could. The invasion was not Poland's alone to bear for long. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, fulfilling the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Polish defenders, already overwhelmed by German might, now faced attack on two fronts. The nation fought valiantly, its cavalry charging tanks, its soldiers resisting with courage, but the odds were insurmountable. Within weeks, Poland was carved apart, its government fleeing into exile. The map of Europe was rewritten once again, drawn not in negotiation rooms, but in the smoke of battle. For Hitler, the swift victory confirmed his belief in Germany's strength and the weakness of his enemies. For Stalin, the conquest of eastern Poland expanded Soviet territory and influence. For Britain and France, however, the war had only just begun. Their armies mobilized along the Western Front, but the months ahead would bring a strange stillness, a period remembered as the phony war, when soldiers waited in trenches and fortifications while battles raged elsewhere. Yet the calm was deceptive, for the storm was gathering strength. The invasion of Poland was more than the start of a new war. It was the collapse of an old world. The illusions of appeasement, the hopes of diplomacy, the dreams of peace secured through treaties and pacts, all were swept away in a matter of days. The abyss that had loomed so near in 1938 had opened wide, and the world had stepped into it. Now, close your eyes and imagine a night in Warsaw in September 1939. The city is dark, the streets filled with rubble, the air heavy with smoke. Families huddle in cellars as bombs fall, the ground trembling with each impact. Somewhere in the distance, church bells toll faintly, their sound mingling with sirens and the drone of engines overhead. And yet, even in this moment of fear, voices whisper prayers, hands hold tightly, and hearts refuse to surrender. The spark that has lit the world is not only destruction, it is also resilience, courage, and the stubborn will of people to endure. As autumn deepens, Europe is at war once more. The silence after the guns of 1918 has ended, replaced by the roar of a new conflict that will surpass even the horrors of the first. From the fields of Poland to the streets of London and Paris, from Berlin to Moscow, the world is drawn into the fire. The story of how it began is now complete, but the story of where it will lead has only just begun. And so, from the silence that followed the guns of 1918 to the thunder that returned in 1939, we have drifted gently through the fragile decades that bridged two wars. We have wandered among the treaties and promises, the hope and despair, the illusions of peace, and the harsh awakenings that shaped a generation. The story of what really started the Second World War is not just the tale of leaders and armies, but of ordinary lives, of families rebuilding in fragile peace, of workers standing in bread lines, of children learning beneath banners they did not choose. It is a story of longing, of mistakes, and of choices that carried the world step by step toward the abyss. If you're still awake, let your thoughts fade like mist across the plain, and let rest find you softly and slowly. Or, if you are still full of quiet curiosity, you might wish to journey onward with another of our videos, perhaps to ancient worlds, long-lost civilizations, or timeless mysteries still waiting to be uncovered. Wherever you are, thank you for listening, for sharing this quiet passage through time. Your presence, scattered across the world yet united in this moment, is part of what makes these journeys special. Until next time, sleep well.